The door to the cozy corner cafe burst open, letting in a gust of cool afternoon air. Heads turned briefly to see the source of the interruption. A man, mid-30s, his sharp gaze scanning the room until it locked on Barron Trump. Barron, seated by the large window overlooking the bustling street, felt the intensity of the stranger's glare but chose not to look up from his book. The cafe's warm, inviting atmosphere seemed momentarily disrupted by the stranger's stormy presence. It was a breezy afternoon in downtown Philadelphia, and the cafe exuded an almost magical charm. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the faint notes of jazz playing softly in the background. The gentle hum of conversation and the rhythmic clinking of cups added to the place's comforting rhythm. Barron, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, looked like any other young man seeking a moment of peace. His tall frame, slightly hunched over the book he was engrossed in, blended into the surroundings, or so he thought. The stranger's boots clunked heavily against the wooden floor as he approached Barron's table. Conversations dwindled to a whisper, and the air grew thick with tension. Barron's serene facade showed no cracks. He turned a page deliberately as if refusing to acknowledge the brewing storm. "You think you're better than us?" The voice was loud and sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Barron froze mid-turn, not out of fear, but from the sheer unexpectedness of the accusation. Slowly, he raised his eyes from the book, meeting the stranger's fiery gaze. The man's face bore the marks of a hard life, deep lines etched into his forehead, a rough beard peppered with gray. His clothes, though clean, spoke of someone who'd weathered more storms than most. The tension in his posture made it clear he wasn't here for pleasantries. Barron blinked once, then closed his book carefully, placing it on the table with an almost ceremonial precision. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the man's barely contained fury. The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes locked on the unfolding scene. "Sir," Barron began, his voice steady and measured, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but perhaps we can talk about it." The stranger's lips curled into a scoff, his fists clenching at his sides. "Talk? What could you possibly say that I'd want to hear?" His voice trembled, not with fear, but with raw, unfiltered anger. Barron remained seated, his expression calm, but not indifferent. "Sometimes," he said, leaning back slightly, "it's not about what I say, but about what you want me to hear." The cafe, now eerily quiet, hung on every word. The barista's hand hovered near the phone, her eyes darting between the two men. The stranger hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Barron's unexpected response. The tension in his shoulders softened just a fraction, but his guard remained firmly in place. "Why would I waste my time telling you anything?" he spat, though his tone lacked the earlier venom. Barron's reply came swiftly, his voice calm but firm. "Because maybe, just maybe, it's worth a try." For a moment the man stood frozen, the conflict within him visible on his face. Then, with a rough scrape of the chair, he sat down across from Barron, his posture rigid and his expression guarded.
The room seemed to exhale collectively as the scene shifted from confrontation to something more uncertain. The barista put down the phone, and the soft jazz music once again filled the background. Barron leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering yet free of judgment. "All right," the stranger muttered, his voice gruff. "You want to know? Fine. Let's see how much you can handle." Barron's response was a small, almost imperceptible nod. The stage was set, not for a battle of words, but for something far more profound, a conversation that would challenge not just the two men at the table, but everyone in the room to rethink their own perspectives. Barron had chosen this tucked-away cafe for a rare taste of anonymity. As the youngest son of a former president, he rarely got to experience the luxury of blending in. The world saw him as a symbol, a name that carried its own whetted double-edged sword that came with privilege but also relentless scrutiny. Here, however, he had found solace among strangers who seemed too engrossed in their own lives to notice him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like just another face in the crowd. The cafe's intimate setting offered a sense of warmth that felt almost therapeutic. The chatter of other patrons, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the faint clinking of ceramic cups created an orchestra of normalcy. Yet, this fragile peace was shattered in an instant by the stranger's piercing voice. "You think you're better than us." The accusation echoed through the room, leaving a trail of unease. Conversations halted abruptly, and all eyes turned toward the man who had dared to disrupt the calm. Barron remained seated, his expression unreadable but calm. He had spent years honing the art of staying composed in the face of confrontation. Slowly, he looked up, his gaze meeting the man's fiery eyes. The stranger's face was etched with frustration and exhaustion. The kind born of a life filled with struggles and unfulfilled dreams. "What's this about?" Barron's tone was measured, neither defensive nor dismissive. The man stepped closer, his voice rising. "You sit there, acting like you're one of us, but you're not. You'll never know what it means to fight for every scrap, to wonder if tomorrow you'll even have a roof over your head." The barista, sensing the growing tension, froze mid-step, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. Barron's calmness in the face of the stranger's anger was both unsettling and disarming. Slowly, he closed the book he'd been reading and set it aside. "You're right," Barron said simply, his voice carrying a surprising sincerity. "I've never had to face those kinds of struggles. But that doesn't mean I can't understand, or that I don't want to." The room seemed to hold its breath as the two locked eyes. The man's hostility wavered for a brief moment before he scoffed. "Understand? What could you possibly understand about people like me?" Barron gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Maybe not much, but I'm willing to listen if you're willing to tell me." The offer hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if searching for hidden motives. The room remained silent, the other patrons pretending not to watch but failing miserably. "You want to listen?" the man said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Fine, but don't expect me to hold back." With that, he pulled out the chair and sat down, his movements tense and deliberate. Barron nodded, his demeanor unchanged. "That's all I ask." The barista exhaled softly, relief evident on her face. The tension in the room began to dissipate, though the curiosity lingered. What followed was a moment suspended in time, the beginning of a conversation that no one in the cafe would forget. The tension in the room was palpable as the man's voice grew louder. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter," he spat, his hands trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it means to struggle?" The words hung in the air, biting and harsh, causing the air to grow thick with discomfort. Patrons shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances, and the barista stood frozen, her fingers twitching near the phone, ready to call for help if needed. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, Barron's calm gaze never wavered. Slowly, he closed the book he had been reading and set it down gently, his movements measured. The silence in the cafe stretched as his steady presence contrasted sharply with the man's raw fury. Without a hint of defensiveness, Barron looked up and met the stranger's fiery eyes, his voice breaking the stillness. "Sir," Barron said, his voice low and composed, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but perhaps we can talk about it." His words were an invitation, not a challenge. The stranger scoffed loudly, shaking his head as if the suggestion was absurd. "Talk? What could you possibly say that I'd want to hear?" His voice was thick with contempt. The room, once buzzing with soft conversation and the quiet hum of the espresso machine, now hung in a heavy silence. Instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron did something that seemed to surprise everyone. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him, a subtle yet firm invitation. "Please, sit," he said, his tone calm and unthreatening. For a moment, the man stood frozen, clearly taken aback. He scanned Barron's face, searching for something mockery, arrogance, anything that would validate his anger. But Barron's expression remained neutral, offering no signs of judgment. After a beat, the stranger let out a grunt and slowly, reluctantly, pulled the chair out and sat down across from Barron. "Fine," the man muttered under his breath. "You want to hear my story? Fine, I'll tell you." Barron nodded once, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face. "That's all I ask." The barista, still standing at the counter, let out a slow breath of relief. The tension that had gripped the room began to loosen, though the curiosity remained. What had started as a confrontation was slowly becoming something else, a conversation, a chance for something deeper to unfold. As the stranger began to speak, the air around them seemed to shift. The cafe, once full of the usual background noise, now felt like a hushed theater, the rest of the world forgotten for the moment. The man's voice was raw as he began to share his pain. "I had it all, you know," he said, his eyes unfocused, lost in his memories. "A job, a family, a future, and then it all came crashing down. The factory closed. One by one, all of us were left behind, abandoned by the system, by everyone who said they cared." Barron listened intently, his gaze never leaving the man's face. He wasn't just hearing the words. He was absorbing the weight of them, trying to understand the depth of the pain they carried. The man continued, his voice cracking under the strain of emotions long buried. "Do you know what it feels like?" the man asked, his voice breaking. "To be looked down on. To be treated like you don't matter. I had a life. And now, I'm nothing. Just another guy in a coffee shop. Invisible." Barron's expression softened, though he didn't respond immediately. He let the man's words hang in the air, giving him the space to speak his truth. Finally, Barron spoke, his voice gentle yet firm. "I don't know your pain," he said softly, "but I do know what it's like to feel judged. Before you've had the chance to show who you are." The man's gaze faltered for a moment, and Barron saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The walls, built up over years of hardship and anger, began to crack. Barron continued, his words measured, but heartfelt. People look at me and see a name. They don't see me. They don't see the person behind it. Just their own frustrations, their own assumptions, and I'm guessing it's the same for you. The man's posture shifted slightly, the edge of his defensiveness beginning to fade. I'm not here to argue with you, Barron added, his voice carrying a sense of quiet sincerity. I just want to understand. Maybe if we all listened a little more, we'd realize we're not as different as we think. There was a long pause. The man's lips tightened, his jaw clenching, but his shoulders seemed to ease just a fraction. Barron's words had struck a chord, though the man was still fighting the urge to retreat into his anger. It was clear that this wasn't an easy conversation for either of them, but there was something shifting beneath the surface, a moment of connection, however small. The barista, standing off to the side, glanced around at the other patrons. The unease that had once permeated the room had slowly been replaced with a quiet curiosity. No one moved, no one dared to interrupt. It was as if everyone in the cafe was waiting for something that would change the course of the conversation. Something that would take this tense standoff and turn it into a turning point. As the man finally exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his emotions evident. It was clear he had more to say, but for the first time in a long while, he was no longer sure how to say it. The dialogue between them was just beginning, and the real work of understanding was still to come. The stranger's scoff echoed through the room, sharp and dismissive. He took a step back, his arms folding across his chest. Talk. What could you possibly say that I'd want to hear? His voice was thick with skepticism, disbelief, and something else, fear. Perhaps fear of being seen, of letting down the walls he had built around himself. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, wondering if this moment would escalate into something worse. But Barron didn't match the man's aggression. Instead, his calm gaze never wavered, and his posture remained open and inviting. With a subtle but deliberate gesture, he pointed to the empty chair across from him. Please, sit, he said simply, his tone both disarming and sincere. The man froze, momentarily caught off guard by the offer. His eyes scanned Barron's face, looking for any sign of mockery, but found none. There was no arrogance, no superiority, just a quiet invitation to share the space between them. The stranger's brows furrowed, and for a long moment, the tension in his body was palpable. He looked at the chair, then back at Barron, clearly torn between his anger and something deeper, inside a hesitation, a curiosity, maybe even a sense of exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man let out a sharp exhale and dragged the chair out, his movements stiff and deliberate. He sat down, his posture still rigid, his jaw clenched, but something had shifted. The storm was still there, but it was tempered by the weight of the moment. Fine, the man muttered, his voice low. You want to hear about the real world? About what it's really like? Fine, I'll tell you. He seemed to brace himself, the words coming out slowly, as if they had been buried deep for far too long. Barron nodded once, his expression steady but warm. That's all I ask. The rest of the cafe, which had been eerily silent, now felt like a stage. The soft clink of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine, the only background noise. The air between Barron and the stranger was thick with unspoken tension, but also a strange sense of possibility. Something had shifted in the stranger's tone, in the way he reluctantly agreed to speak. Barron could sense an opening, an opportunity to listen, to truly hear the other side of the story. The man began to speak, his words initially jagged and sharp, his anger still bubbling under the surface. I had it all, he said, his voice trembling with frustration. A job, a family, a house, the American dream, right, and then, it all fell apart. The factory closed, and just like that, I was nothing. I lost everything, my job, my dignity, my sense of security. One day, everything's fine, and the next, you're out on the street, wondering how the hell you're gonna make it. Barron listened, his gaze unwavering, but not judgmental. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer words of sympathy, or make any attempt to lighten the mood. He simply listened, allowing the man to speak his truth. And as the stranger spoke, Barron could see the rough edges of his anger begin to soften. Like stone eroding under the flow of water. Do you know what it feels like? The man asked suddenly, his voice quieter now, less angry. To walk into a room and feel like everyone's judging you, like you don't matter, like you're invisible. His eyes met Barron's, searching for something, a sign that Barron understood, that he wasn't just another person who would dismiss him. Barron nodded slightly, his eyes steady. I don't know your pain, he said softly, but I do know what it's like to feel judged. Before you've had the chance to show who you really are, the man's gaze faltered for a moment, a flicker of something passing through his eyes. Barron's words had landed somewhere deep inside him, and for the first time, he seemed to be questioning the walls he had built around himself. The harsh lines of his anger started to fade, and his shoulders, which had been rigid and defensive, seemed to loosen just a little. Barron continued, his voice calm and reflective. People look at me and see a name. They don't see me, the person. They see their own assumptions, their own frustrations, and I think that's what's happening here, too. You're seeing what you want to see, and I'm doing the same. But maybe if we stop looking at each other through those lenses, we'll realize we're not so different. The man's face was still tight with emotion, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge Barron's words. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, as if weighing the sincerity behind the younger man's words. The tension in the room had shifted again, though no one could quite tell if the conversation had reached its breaking point, or if it was just the beginning. I'm not here to argue with you, Barron said gently. I just want to understand. Maybe if we all listened a little more, really listened, we realize we have more in common than we think. For a moment, the man said nothing. He just sat there, his hands still clenched in his lap, his jaw still tight, but his eyes softened, just a fraction. And for the first time since he walked into the cafe, there was a sense that the walls between them, though still high, had begun to crack, ever so slightly. The man's voice shook with emotion. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I fought for it all, and then it slipped away. His anger was now tinged with sorrow. Barron listened, calm. I may not know your struggles, but I know what it's like to be judged without being seen. People look at me and only see a name. They don't see me. His words were simple, but they resonated deeply. The man faltered, his anger fading. It's not just about losing things, it's about losing who you are. Barron's voice softened. What's left is you. You define yourself, not by what's been taken, but by what you choose to become. The man hesitated, his shoulders loosening. I've been angry for so long. I thought it would help. Barron nodded. Letting go of anger is hard, but it's the first step toward rebuilding. You don't have to carry it alone. The man looked up, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maybe you're right, he said softly. The silence between them felt full of possibility. The man stood up slowly, his anger replaced by something quieter, deeper. You're not what I expected, he said, his voice calmer, almost respectful. Barron gave him a small, knowing smile. And maybe you're not either. The man nodded, as if processing the conversation, the weight of it sinking in. I came in here mad, thinking I'd never see eye to eye with you, but you listened. That's all anyone really needs, sometimes. Barron didn't speak, just nodded as the man walked away, his steps slower now, less burdened. The patrons in the cafe exchanged quiet glances, the tension that had gripped the room now gone. The barista smiled, relieved. Barron returned to his book, the air around him lighter. The encounter had changed something in the room. The quiet power of listening, of understanding, had left everyone with something to reflect on. Empathy, kindness, and the unexpected paths to connection. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of listening to change the course of a conversation or even a life. When we stop assuming and start understanding, we open the door to connection and empathy. We're all more alike than we think, and taking the time to truly hear someone can make all the difference. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And if you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's spread kindness and understanding, one story at a time.